Thank you, Vabia. So we are live now, and good evening, ma'am, and everyone. Thank you for joining our 12th, or you can say the last public lecture in 2024, organized by Cultural Studies Research Forum, concerning the topic Rethinking Indigeneity and Ecocritical Perspective. Before further proceeding, here is a brief introduction of our organization, CSRF. Launched in 2022, the CSRF is a student led non-profit dedicated to promoting intellectual curiosity. We organize free public lectures and discussion on diverse topics in cultural studies, from literature and dance to music and food. By exposing students to cutting edge research and fostering critical thinking, we aim to empower the next generation of scholars and artists. Now, I would love to call Lisbeth Sain to introduce our esteemed resource person, Professor Debashree Dattaray, ma'am. Lisbeth, over to you.
Thank you, Koe. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Debashree Dattaray, a distinguished academician, holds the position of Professor of Comparative Literature and Deputy Coordinator at the Center for Canadian Studies, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. She is also the current chairperson of the Department of Comparative Literature at the university. Her academic journey has been enriched by prestigious fellowships and awards, including the Fulbright Alumni Award 2019, Shastri Mobility Program at McGill University, CCOPS Fellowship at the University of Pavia, Erasmus Mundus Europe Asia Fellowship at the University of Amsterdam, and Fulbright Doctoral Fellowship at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. Dr. Dattaray's research interests span a diverse range of fields encompassing environmental studies, indigenous studies, comparative Indian literature methodology, and gender studies. Her scholarly contributions are evident in her publications such as Oral Traditions of the Northeast, a case study of Karbi oral traditions, and she has also co-edited volumes like At the Crossroads of Literature and Culture, Following Forkhead Paths, Discussions on the Narrative, Ecocriticism and Environment, Rethinking Literature and Culture, Literature and the Other Arts, and Finding Philosophers in Global Fiction. She has also served as the issue editor for a special volume on indigenous studies for LitCrit, an Indian response to literature. Dr. Dattaray has actively engaged in research projects, including the Jadavpur University RUSA 2.0 project on locating indigeneity in the global South, revival, conservation, sustainability, and the ICSSR major research project on digital empowerment and traditional knowledge systems, a case study of Bankura and Purulia, West Bengal. Her commitment to the academic community is reflected in her role as an editorial board member of LitCrit, an Indian response to literature, and Lagoon Scenes, the Venice Journal of Environmental Studies. She currently serves as the zonal representative for the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. It is a great honor to have you with us today, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this forum, and I'm very glad that Wildlife Foundation is taking up this initiative. So very, very happy to be here. Thank you also for the warm introduction. We will, as you know, I've shared a slide, but before that, when we are talking about two things today. One is indigeneity, and the other is in terms of ecocritical perspectives or in terms of land. So the first part of our discussion should be about what are the challenges of indigeneity? What are the challenges that indigeneity has faced through the years, over the years, and this is something that has continued and continues as you and I speak today. So one of the things that I want to start off, and I'm assuming that there would be an interest in indigenous research, is to start with a video. This is a poem by Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Linda Tuhiwai Smith is a Maori scholar. I will speak more about this later on, but this particular poem is a reflection of the challenges faced by indigenous communities across the globe. So if the particular video that I had shared could be played, and then we can go on to the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Sure, ma'am.
It began long before the Holocaust scientists experimented on Jews, Gypsies, and others they hated. Before their industrial scale genocide brought modernity down and Nuremberg set out a code. It began long before Tuskegee, the deliberate infecting of syphilis into black men's bodies to study their bad blood. Science voyeurs, watching their method at work, killing their participants one by one by one. It began long before the Havasupai had their DNA taken under one guise and then used against them under another, taking from the sick to feed the well, simply because they believed in their moral right to do so. It began long before the Portuguese had improved their instruments of navigation, enabling them to sail beyond their imaginations. It began before Columbus left Spain's harbours, before Cook set sail for Tahiti, before slave traders and missionaries crossed the Atlantic and Pacific, before the great synergy of capitalism, science, nation building, and empire, before the doctrine of discovery legitimated and fueled Europe's quest for eternity. It began long before the slaughter, enslavement, and genocide of native peoples, before their nations, their lands, their bodies, before their tattooed heads, their skins, their vaginas, penises, and wombs were smashed into millions of fragmented pieces, before they were disemboweled, disembodied, reduced to collectible artifacts, exotic furnishings for the salons and sitting rooms of the wealthy. The process of dehumanizing, of not recognizing the human, of rendering others as beasts of burden, as less than human, as partial humans, as not quite humans, as soulless beings, as savage creatures. The process of conquering the other, of wielding them to the will of empires, is deeply written in the history of Europe, of Rome and Greece, of Great Britain, of Versailles, of little fiefdoms and all conquering heroes we read in Europe's history of itself. The separation of flora and fauna, of humans from other beings, of humans from nature, of mind and body, of white and black, of civilized and savage, the positing of a soul, heaven and hell, of human will, intelligence, morality, of emotions, of race, of gender, of the being of a human, of the rights of a human, of the natural order of things. These were the technologies that were present and were honed in the colonies, in the concentration camps, in the prisons, on the reserves, in the laboratories, in the institutions of knowledge. These are the tools we teach and promote that will inform and discipline, that will help and save, that will develop and advance the humans that these tools have dehumanized. the stories that these tools have silenced, the relationships that these tools have subverted, the environment that these tools have contaminated. It began in the foment of language and ideas, incited by power and opportunity, emboldened by a sense of godliness, institutionalized in church and state, practiced on women, on children, on the poor, on other human beings, was taken with the word and the sword across oceans and continents, across mountains and deserts and rivers. It was present in their gaze as they surveyed the lands of others. It was present in their bodies as they infected villages, cities, and civilizations. It was present in their minds as they built their governments, missions, and schools, as they made laws and regulations, as they built prisons and slums, laboratories and roads. Their values, their beliefs, their norms, their words, their feelings, their touch, their thoughts, their fears, their dreams, their fantasies. It began there in the essence of their humanity.
Thank you. We can now begin with the slide. The first slide, just keep it to the first slide, please. Yeah, I mean the first slide after my name, that's all. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So if you look at it, some of the concerns of Indigenous studies are enumerated here. And while all of this is important, what I want you all to pay attention to is the last line that we have here. It is important to listen, internalize, learn, imagine, and empathize. Not my words, but Professor Ganesh Devi's word, who has worked extensively in this area. When we are trying to rethink indigeneity from an eco-critical perspective, it involves challenging conventional narratives about nature, culture, and progress, and to emphasize on the ecological, spiritual, and epistemological system and significance of indigenous knowledge system. So ecocriticism, as we know, critically examines the relation between literature, culture, and environment. And this in turn provides a transformative framework for reimagining indigeneity. So now the rethinking is important because we are moving beyond, we are looking at indigeneity as an ongoing process and as a way that will provide us profound insights into matters.
You've plugged into Nirvana. Your device is ready to pair.
Into issues related to sustainability,
You're now connected to both
and
stuff.
human-nature relations. Perhaps people who have inadvertently opened their microphones could be requested to mute them. Thank you. So what we are looking at is we are also looking at indigenous, if you move on to it, how do you define indigenous knowledge? So if you look into the next slide, indigenous knowledge tries to define local knowledge that is unique to a given society or culture. And it is based on local level interactions. Now, this local level interaction is very important for us because we are also trying to reconceptualize indigeneity beyond identity and culture. All right. So not just identity that is tied to cultural practices, traditions, or geographical locations. Ecocriticism will invite a more dynamic understanding of indigeneity, which goes beyond cultural markers and includes an intrinsic relation to both the land and the environment. So indigenous knowledge becomes not just a set of beliefs or practices. It's a worldview deeply tied to the land, ecosystems, and non-human beings. It's a question of understanding how we believe in the term all our relations. When we are talking about all our relations, it means that you're connected not just to your family, but everything around you. All right. The next slide, please. Yeah. Mhm. Yes, and then the next slide. Yeah. I thought you had moved. Okay. The next slide, please. Yeah. So if you're looking at indigenous communities and indigenous people, you're also trying to understand this unique system of knowledge. And also to be very careful about when you're trying to understand this unique system of knowledge, one is to recognize two aspects. One, are you an outsider to the community or are you someone who belongs to the community? And your research interest and your research position will change according to that specific location. If we look into the next slide, you'll find that this indigenous knowledge includes an all-inclusive process. It involves knowledge that is not static and it evolves and changes as it develops. Now, what does this mean and what are we trying to understand here? We are trying to look at a core principle of indigenous knowledge as a belief that all elements of the natural world, plants, animals, water, air, even geological formations, are interconnected. So, ecocriticism will try to celebrate indigenous ecological wisdom and to offer a systemic approach to environmentalism. And that will perhaps contrast with maybe fragmented, anthropocentric approaches common to Western thought. So, indigenous knowledge will include various practices of sustainable fishing, rotational farming, controlled burning. It also involves a very deeply embedded understanding of the world around you and a very sophisticated and nuanced approach to ecological leadership. All right. What you're also trying to look at it, and this is very important, you're trying to connect, and this is something that we'll come to later as well. You're trying to rethink nature. How? Because nature over here is not a subject. The nature over here is not an object, but a subject. Indigenous worldviews, and if you go on to the next slide, you will understand what I'm talking about. The next slide. All right. If you look at the indigenous, the next slide that we have, this is a very important slide. You find indigenous knowledge right at the center with local knowledge, health, agriculture, food, nutrition, biodiversity, culture, performance, education, ethics and value systems, science, technology, elders, and local knowledge coming and adding to this. So your center of study is this, and connected to this is the understanding of indigenous languages. How does language work? What one needs to understand is land is not just a physical entity. Land is something that is connected to language, and therefore indigenous sovereignty, indigenous identity is connected to the land itself. So ecocriticism aligns with indigenous thought by advocating for a view of the natural world as this network of relationships where humans are just not the center of it, they are part of a larger ecological whole. So, for example, if you were to take the Maori concept of Venuha or land, it's not just a physical space, but a source of identity and spiritual connection and responsibility. So, the land is seen as this living entity with its own agency and something that humans must respect and protect. It's also very important over here how women are seen as the center of this community, are seen in the center of many indigenous communities, and to reinstate the role of women in the community is to begin a process of healing in every sense of the word. The next question that you would have to ask us is why do we need to think about indigeneity at all? How is it important? Why indigenous knowledge systems are relevant to us? If you look at the next slide, you will find that indigenous knowledge system tries to foreground multiple ways of knowing the world around you. It draws attention to colonial and neo-colonial encounters in a global world, and it offers possibility of a different universal knowledge. Indigenous knowledge system also gives us a sense of community and the individual who functions within the community. In this sense, what is important is the role of storytelling and oral traditions. Indigenous cultures, as we know, have long relied on oral traditions, storytelling, and methodologies that transmit ecological knowledge. These narratives are interconnected, and eco-criticism, indigenous stories are seen as ecological texts, texts that in turn encode knowledge and sustainable living, interspecies cooperation, and ecological resilience. Now, and this resilience, you must realize, is not easy to come by because it's a reflection of how the world has perceived indigenous communities. And one needs to fight against such stereotypes when you're even speaking about the relationship of indigeneity and eco-criticism. So this is important because they don't just offer such storytelling formations, such forms of narratives do not just serve as entertainment, but they are ways in which you're trying to educate younger generations who have often been denied their history or their relationship with the world around. So, from an eco-critical perspective, these stories actually provide us with alternative models for environmental engagement, models that will resist exploitation and seek balance and coexistence. So this is what we are trying to get. Look at the slide. I really appreciate if people learned to mute themselves. And if the host could please do that. Thank you. Yeah, if you look into the next slide, you will find that how do you talk about indigenous knowledge system? You're trying to talk about indigenous knowledge system as an inclusion in mainstream curriculum. You're talking about the interface between indigenous knowledge system and science, for example. And most importantly, you're talking about location. Therefore, what is our methodology? Our methodology involves diverse perspectives, diverse knowledge, and that takes us to the next slide. In diverse methodology, you're looking into indigenous languages, you're looking into local concepts and role of women, something that we've spoken about. We are also speaking of activities, workshops, dialogues with indigenous elders, and it involves a process of unlearning and learning. Unlearning in the sense that you're talking about unlearning in terms of whatever has been received and trying to know a different method of knowledge, all right? And this involves a certain understanding of cultural sensitivity. How does the world work? How does the world around you work? What is it that we are looking at? What is also significant over here is we're also looking at indigenous-based assignments. You're looking at a process of cultural sensitivity. Including this, we are also trying to understand how colonialism, perhaps, and something that we began the class with, has affected environmental displacement and land rights. So the history of colonialism, as we would have realized from the poem by Linda Smith, has had a profound effect on indigenous people and their relationship to the land. Because colonization has involved displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands, and it has led to the demolition of ecosystems and also the loss of traditional ecological knowledge or the loss of language per se. So eco-criticism tries to challenge the historical and contemporary systems of dispossession and destruction that indigenous people have faced. So, for eco-critics, the story of indigeneity is also one of resistance to environmental injustice. This is very important. Indigenous communities, despite being subjected to all forms of atrocities and displacement, are often in the forefront of environmental activism today. They advocate for land rights, ecological restoration, and the recognition of traditional ecological knowledge. So ecocriticism tries to bring out the idea of environmental justice. And in this context, decolonization is inseparable. Why are we even talking about this? The reason that we are talking about it because we need to understand that climate change and indigenous knowledge are, as a solution to that, is inseparable, all right? And if you look at it, before we speak about how this is inseparable, try to look at the conflicts and negotiations that indigenous knowledge systems face in the next slide. You will find one, marginalization, two is exclusion, lack of protection of knowledge, lack of recognition of knowledge holders, role of researchers is very important over here, and the functionality of government, science councils, universities, and indigenous communities. We need to understand that one needs to take cognizance of all of these factors when working in this area. So, what are we trying to do? We try to understand that in the context of global climate change, indigenous knowledge is seen as this crucial partner, in a partner which will enable us to address environmental degradation. So ecocriticism tries to frame indigenous knowledge as essential in the fight against climate change, and especially in trying to understand land preservation, conservation, and indigenous people have a profound understanding of the world around them, of their ecosystems, and they contribute to more sustainable practices. So, for example, indigenous communities in the Amazon have long practiced methods of agroforestry, and that has enhanced biodiversity and maintained soil fertility. What we are also trying to look at is the integration of indigenous perspectives into policy making. That's something that's happened in Australia, for example, and trying to provide us solutions that are centered on community-based ecological sustainable practices. If you move on to the next slide, this is something that I wanted to talk about. Linda Smith wrote this path-breaking book called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People, and talks about, and she's the one who actually, the poem was done after 20 years. This book came out in 1999. Since then, there have been 3 editions. The 3rd edition has also come out. 3 editions of the book. And in 2019, the world at large, just before the COVID-19, celebrated 20 years of Linda Smith's book. And this poem came out of it. One of the things that Linda Smith tells us in the book is the word research is the dirtiest word in the Indigenous person's dictionary because it leads to self-doubt, it leads to exploitation, it leads to unhappiness about the relation between an Indigenous person and the non-Indigenous person. And this is something that we need to remember whenever we are looking into these research areas. How does one talk about this? So one of the things that we are trying to do is we are trying to reimagine environmentalism through an indigenous lens. If you go on to the next slide, please. Linda Smith over here is concerned, Linda Smith is concerned not so much with the actual technique of selecting a method, but much more with the context in which research problems are conceptualized and designed, and with the implications of research for its participants and their communities. So what we are trying to understand is the ethics of research. What is the ethics of research? How do you read research, all right? And how do you read research is related to a certain system where one respects the indigenous perspective and does not try to really impose something that is not beyond the indigenous perspective. What's also crucial over here is the ability to understand that the key goal of ecocriticism in relation to indigeneity is to reimagine environmentalism and to prioritize long-term sustainability, respect for nature, and community-centered approaches. So the dominant environmental discourse, often rooted in Western individualism and market-based solutions, has failed to address the ecological crisis facing the planet. One of the most important events that happened right before COVID-19 was the major bushfire in Australia. And a lot of indigenous community people felt that, had there been indigenous practices of sustainability, this havoc would not have happened. By incorporating indigenous perspectives on the interconnectedness of life, reciprocal relations with nature, and the ethical dimensions of land and resource management, ecocriticism, I think, provides this critical space for rethinking environmentalism as a practice rooted in justice, responsibility, and collective well being. If you move on to the next slide, you will find that there is a holistic perspective. This holistic perspective is based in a way where you're trying to place indigenous perspectives at the center of inquiry. Rather than thinking of it as being an object of study, indigenous perspectives become agencies of change. So the emphasis is on place. It's grounded in indigenous languages and meaning making. It often has a decolonizing aim. The emphasis is on how meaning is created relationally and recognizes and respects indigenous sovereignty, and it must benefit indigenous communities. This becomes something very important when you're looking at indigenous perspectives from a wholesome view. Why is this important? Why are we even talking about this? One of the aspects that we need to understand is we are trying to look at this whole idea of the traumatic issues related to environmental injustice, climate breakdown, and biodiversity loss. uh, One needs to explore ways in which activists, scholars, and policymakers can take recourse in indigenous knowledge systems for an understanding of sustainable ways of living. So, what we are trying to do is we are trying to prioritize ecological wisdom embedded in indigenous cultures and that would challenge technocratic solutions. So, you're looking at it as a response to a more inclusive, decolonial, and ethically grounded environmental approach. So, also, environmental humanities, for example, with its emphasis on human culture, ethics, history, and storytelling, it is an ideal platform to engage with the complex knowledge system of indigenous communities and to understand their practice of sustainable environmental management. So, what you're trying to do is you're trying to highlight discussions that have been happening on deep place based knowledge and which have helped indigenous community to live sustainably for thousands of years. So what we're also trying to look is we're trying to integrate indigenous knowledge with environmental humanities and to rethink the prevailing assumption that environmental solutions can only come from modern science and industrialized systems. So we are arguing for return to land-based community-centered models of ecological leadership which emphasizes on indigenous practices such as land management, sustainable agriculture, sacred ecology, cosmologies, and that humans are interconnected and in relation to the world in all aspects. So, we're trying to foreground an approach to change that is systemic, holistic, collective, community directed, and transformative. And that would initiate a process of working with policymakers, artists, activists, and scholars. We are also trying to engage on notions of cultural sustainability in terms of social justice and self determination, knowledge of community organizing strategies, and particularly in relation to cultural democracy and environmental sustainability across nations. So, what is it that we are looking at? If you look at the final slide of the PPT, the next one, please. Yeah. You'll find that when you're looking at indigenous studies, we are looking into indigenous information protocols. What are these protocols that we are talking about? One is that it relates to all aspects of information of life cycle. There is no single truth, no one universally accepted standards, which means it would question notions of power equations and it could also diverge from Western models or mainstream models. And it is something that would be determined by indigenous communities. How do they perceive the world around you? How do they live the world around you? What's also significant over here is you're therefore trying to look at certain salient features over here. One is you're trying to recover lived experiences and understand rootedness and the fear of displacement in a world that struggles with the pervasive presence of climate change even today. We are trying to also understand the indigenous voice and influence in society and the possibility of a positive collaboration. Most importantly, we are trying to engage with ways in which the global south continues to experience the effects of colonial oppression in an era of climate crisis. What's also important is we are trying to understand ways in which cultural influences the natural environment within both rural and urban contexts in indigenous communities, and trying to understand how digitization would work in these knowledge systems. So it's an interdisciplinary approach that we are talking about. We are also trying to understand a timely intervention on issues of environmental justice, climate change, and sustainability. What is significant over here is rethinking indigeneity from an ecocritical perspective would involve acknowledging the central role of indigenous knowledge in shaping sustainable futures. Now, placing indigenous epistemologies at the heart of environmental discourse, ecocriticism can offer a way forward that prioritizes ecological restoration, social justice, and also cultural resilience. So, what we are talking about is a call for a radical reimagining of our relationships to the land, urging us to move beyond exploitative models of nature and towards more holistic, relational, and ethical practices that respect both indigenous wisdom and the environment. It's a connection where we are trying to look at meaning, we are trying to understand place, and most importantly, we are trying to understand language. I would request the organizers to close the PowerPoint and share the video that I had shared again. Thank you. Yeah. Also, a word that I would like to share before we share the video. This is by Emma Stevens, who is an indigenous person, and this is something that they had played in their community. If you look at this, this will give you a sense of both indigenous history and how this has worked in terms of the relation to the world around, to the land around you. So we will look at this particular video right now. Thank you.
Ma'am, just a minute. Maybe
Yeah,
some
sure.
technological issue.
Yes, no problem. If there is a problem and if you can enable me, I can show it as well.
Ma'am, just 1 minute, please. I'm trying.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope the screen is visible. Ma'am, I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
I'm playing it.
The audio isn't. The audio isn't playing.
Sorry, ma'am.
The audio isn't playing.
Oh, okay. Ma'am, then will you please try from your end, if possible? You can share the screen. Sorry, guys, there is a technical fault, so please wait.
Visible, right?
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry to disturb, but the same thing, audio is not audible. I mean, there is no audio.
Oh, is it audible now?
No, ma'am. That is the problem what happened with me as well. Just a minute, ma'am.
Let's. Yeah. That's okay. I think we can share the link with them, then that will be easier. If you could just share the link with them. And that would, because I would like to go to discussion now, so we can do that.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah.
I will share the link in the
Yeah,
group.
so yeah, if you look at the link, you will find that this gives you a sense of the idea of community and how community has worked in diverse aspects. And it's also very beautiful music that you can hear at any point at your time. But it also very,
Ma'am, will
yes,
you
tell me.
please on your video?
Oh,
It is
yes,
off.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Thank
we will also see how this works in terms of a sense of indigeneity and community, because community becomes most crucial for our understanding of ecocriticism and however how we function with the idea of ecocriticism. Right. So I'm open to questions, queries, concerns about being a researcher in indigeneity and of in ecocriticism. And if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And sorry for the interruption.
Hello.
Yes, Roy, please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. First of all, thank you. It was a very enlightening session. I was thinking the way we define indigenous, usually we contrast it with, let's say, the international. But I was thinking of the national versus indigenous, and in context of community radio. So where All India Radio would say, look, we provide programs that can be watched by everybody. Sorry, that can be listened to by everybody in India, and community radios would come up with alternatives where people from the community themselves would be running the radio channels, and it would only be for a limited geographical area. And there again, you would have them discussing indigenous medicines and things like that, which you can't get in All India Radio. So one way that All India Radio counters this is by saying that the content is not filtered, as in it doesn't have the authority of maybe an expert reviewing. But then again, aren't all knowledge systems flawed? So can we just say, just because indigenous knowledge systems may have one flaw or two, does it mean that whatever content appears in larger channels, or to a larger audience, isn't by nature flawed? That was my question.
Yes, thank you. That's a brilliant question, and one that would really trouble a lot of people. So, thank you very much for that. One of the most important things about indigenous communities is that their knowledge needs to be taken seriously. And if you look at the video that we had at the end, which you will, I'm sure, eventually, you will realize that how a community works. A community works with that sense of knowledge around them and trying to understand how that knowledge will be beneficial to anyone and everyone around them. What's also significant about this process is we are trying to understand uh, indigeneity from the perspective of I do not really like to use that word, but I'll use it for ease of reference, is the word tribal. Now, the word tribal, we can use it as a constitutional sense of the word, or we can use it as an official term. But what we are looking at by indigenous communities, we would like to refer to these communities. And the community radio that you're speaking of, or the community knowledge that we are speaking about, this dismissal of knowledge has been an ongoing problem for many indigenous communities. It still is, but they have been very resilient about it. Have been resilient. The fact that you heard Linda Smith speaking about whatever has happened to indigenous communities over thousands of years across the globe, it gives you an instance of that resistance and resilience and why we need to hear the indigenous voice today. I hope that answers your question, Roy.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Anyone else wants to ask?
Yes,
Please,
ma'am.
Debashree.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. I'm Sharudia from Kolkata. And
Yes, hello.
yes, ma'am. Currently, I'm trying to write a research proposal on Amitabh Ghosh from an ecocritical point of view, ma'am.
Yes.
Not exactly. It doesn't deal with indigenous angle, the current topic of discussion today, but I am trying to show the eco-critical and geopolitical concerns that are there in his global works. He has written a wide range of fictional and non-fictional works. So I'm trying to explore how far his geopolitical and eco-critical works are like those concerns are there, ma'am. What I want to know is this a good field to explore? Should I go ahead with it? Or is there anything I can add to it? Please suggest, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very pertinent and practical question. See, Amitav Ghosh is, of course, somebody that one works on in terms of in terms of eco-criticism and everything else. But if one were to work, if you're initiating your research in this area, a suggestion that I would give you is try to look at existing literature in the area and see what has already been done. If you try to look on the internet, if you look at websites that actually have theses from before, you will have a sense of what work has already been done. And that will give you an answer about how you can be different and what other authors you can choose to have a strong research proposal. All right.
Actually,
While
ma'am, yes,
while
ma'am.
you're absolutely on the right track, but you would need to actually find out that since considerable work has been done, the literature review would be important for you to take a final decision.
Yes, ma'am. I have already gone through some of the already published research works, ma'am. The papers, they are available on different platforms. What I want to take up actually, ma'am, the latest book of Amitabh Ghosh, that is the 2023 published Smoke and Ashes. It has
Yeah,
not yet been.
I understand that, but the point
Yes,
is you will
ma'am.
also have to realize
Yes,
that
ma'am.
uh, that you are also supposed to you cannot have just one work for a lifetime relationship with your thesis. The thesis is always a lifetime relationship of 5 years, right? So you would have to have other texts brought into the discussion. And so, which is why just not looking at papers, but also trying to look at material that has perhaps been uploaded, and you can take a look at them and they'll give you your answers. All right?
Yes, ma'am. I have gone through those materials. I am taking a bit. That is why I'm connecting geopolitics with it.
Yeah,
Those
I
two.
think that's a very good idea. Yeah,
Yes, ma'am.
absolutely. Thank you. Yes, I think there was some question in the chat box.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, where does a voice needs? Yes. Well, there have been. This is a good question, very important one, in fact. Uh, the voice of in North America right now, there have been places and interests where actually the indigenous communities or experts and policymakers in the indigenous communities are part of the committee that addresses climate change. So I do know people who are indigenous and who are in the committee, for instance. Excuse me. And which is also true for India to an extent. However, what you need to realize is how much of that is implemented is something that one can see, one can actually address this in the long run. Some of the needs, it's always a difficult relationship and a difficult transaction. A difficult transaction between policy development and the needs of the indigenous communities. What's also important is how indigenous communities try to perceive sustainability. People have also realized that they need to listen to it if they need to protect our planet. So there has been a positive change, but to be very honest, we need to have more changes accordingly. Thank you for that question because it's something that all of us need to think about. Thank you very, very much. Yeah. Any other
Thanks a
question?
lot, ma'am.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How can these eco-critical approaches contribute to the decolonization of environment discourse?
Thank you very much for that question. If you're looking at decolonization, we are talking about processes where you're trying to perhaps rupture the mainstream approach. You're trying to rupture mainstream dominant discourses. And when we are talking about indigenous approaches, that by definition would rupture mainstream discourses and therefore also initiate the process of decolonization. It is based on, if you remember what we began with, is based on mutual relationships. Mutual relationships and also mutual respect for everything around you. So it's not a question of profit and loss. So the moment you realize that this is not a question of profit and loss, you initiate the process of decolonization. Hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Ma'am, can we just try once again to play the video? I think we can do it.
Yes, it would be nice if people could see it. I think that would be useful. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Let me try once again just.
It's
I don't
okay
know.
if it can't happen, but it I think the same problem is persisting today. So it's all right. They don't want to, so it's okay. Cole, I don't think we can hear this. We're not being able to hear this for some reason. Yeah.
Actually, ma'am, I could listen, but yeah, the audio is not. Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And sorry.
No, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. It happens all the time, so don't worry. Yeah.
So, I think if you have any query regarding today's session, you just can, contact with us. We can forward your queries to our ma'am. Now it's time to wrap up this meeting. So, on behalf of CSRF and Bhalat Education Private Limited, I would like to express our sincere gratitude for your insightful and thought-provoking lecture on rethinking indigeneity and ecocritical perspective. It is really, really an engaging talk which deliver actually a lasting impression on all of us. And
Thank
your
you.
exploration of the complex interplay between indigenous cultures and environment has opened a new avenues of thought and understanding. Thank you so much, man. We are truly honored to have you
Thank
here
you.
with us.
Thank you. An honor to be here. Thank you, everyone, for your brilliant questions. And thank you for your support, Wallet and CSR.
Thank you,
Yes,
ma'am.
thank you so
With
much.
your permission, I'm ending
Okay.
this session.
Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.
No, dear. You just see the live, recorded lecture on YouTube. We are not going to provide any PPT. Thank you.
Thank you.